The doctor's hands were trembling. I watched her stare at my file instead of the ultrasound screen, where my baby's heartbeat flickered in black and white. No, her focus stayed on the paperwork, on my husband's name printed neatly at the top. Then, without warning, she turned off the monitor mid-exam, as if someone had abruptly cut the power to my entire life. "Mrs. Mercer," she said softly, her voice barely above a whisper, "I need to speak with you privately right now." She guided me into her office, shut the door, and locked it. I immediately assumed something was wrong with the baby. My heart raced so hard I could hear it in my ears. I couldn't breathe. I couldn't think. Then she said the words that shattered everything. "You need to leave your husband today. Before you go home, contact a divorce lawyer." I actually laughed, out loud. "What? We're expecting a baby. We're happy. I don't understand." That's exactly the problem. Her face had gone pale. "What I'm about to show you will change everything you believe about your marriage. But let me start from the beginning, because you need to understand how you ended up here. 4 months pregnant, discovering that your entire life has been built on lies told by the man beside you every night." My name is Daphne Wilson. I'm 32 years old. I work as a marketing director at a boutique firm in Connecticut. I come from what people politely describe as old money. My grandmother, Eleanor, passed away 5 years ago and left me her estate, about $2.3 million in a trust, along with the historic Wilson family home where 5 generations of women had lived, loved, and raised children. I never showed it off. I built my own career. I drove a 10-year-old Subaru and bought coffee from the same place every morning. The inheritance was security, not identity. But it made me a target. I just didn't realize it yet. I met Grant Mercer 4 years ago at my family's annual charity gala. The Wilsons had hosted it for decades. That night, I was standing at the bar trying to escape a conversation with a man who had asked about my finances within 3 minutes of meeting me. Then Grant appeared, tall, dark-haired, with an easy smile. He asked what I was drinking, joked about the terrible jazz band, and never once mentioned money. He said he was a financial advisor who had received a last-minute invitation from a colleague. He even claimed he didn't know who the Wilson family was. Looking back, that should have been my first warning sign. A financial advisor who doesn't research the host of a major charity event? That's like a chef showing up to a cooking competition without knowing there will be food. But I was tired of obvious opportunists, and here was a charming man asking about my favorite books instead of my bank balance. We dated for a year. Grant was attentive and thoughtful. He remembered the smallest details. He insisted on paying for dinners, even though I could easily afford everything. He seemed completely genuine. My mother, Vivian, saw through him immediately. After their first meeting, she pulled me aside. "That man's smile doesn't reach his eyes," she said. "Something isn't right, Daphne. I can feel it." I dismissed her concerns. I told her she was being paranoid, overprotective, even jealous. We argued about Grant constantly. Eventually, we stopped speaking altogether. 2 years of near silence between me and the woman who raised me. Birthday texts, nothing more. All because I chose to trust my husband over my own mother. And yes, she was right. Grant and I married after a year of dating. It was a beautiful ceremony at my grandmother's estate. He cried during his vows, tears running down his face as he promised to love and protect me forever. Looking back, those were probably the most genuine tears he ever shed. Not from happiness, but from relief. His long-term plan was finally working. After 2 years of trying to conceive naturally, we visited a fertility specialist. The diagnosis was devastating. Grant had severe male factor infertility. His sperm count was extremely low, and what little existed had poor movement. Natural conception was almost impossible. Grant seemed heartbroken. He cried in the car for 20 minutes, apologizing repeatedly as if it were entirely his fault. I comforted him and reassured him that we would handle it together. That's what marriage meant. What I didn't realize was that he wasn't crying out of grief. He was reacting to a complication in his plan. We chose IVF with ICSI, a procedure where a single sperm is injected directly into an egg. It was our best option. Grant insisted on researching clinics himself. He found one he described as perfect and handled all the paperwork. I thought he was being supportive, especially since I was emotionally exhausted. The first cycle failed. It was crushing. I couldn't get out of bed for 3 days. Grant stayed beside me, offering comfort and reassurance, promising we would try again. The second cycle, 7 months ago, succeeded. A positive pregnancy test. 2 pink lines that changed everything. I cried with happiness. Grant held me close, already talking about nursery colors, baby names, and the future he had always imagined. Then, almost casually, he suggested I update my will. "Now that we're a family," he said. It sounded thoughtful and practical, the kind of thing a responsible partner would mention. I had no idea he was already counting my grandmother's inheritance as his own. Everything felt perfect. A loving husband, a baby on the way. The life I had dreamed of since childhood. I didn't know that within 3 months, a stranger with shaking hands would show me documents that would destroy that perfect life. And I had no idea that the person responsible was the man sleeping beside me every night. Before we continue, if you're enjoying this story, consider subscribing and share in the comments where you're watching from and what time it is there. I read every comment, and it truly means a lot. Now, back to the story. At 4 months pregnant, something began to shift in my marriage. At first, it was subtle, the kind of changes you notice but dismiss because the alternative is too painful to accept. Grant started placing his phone face down everywhere. He added a new password I didn't know. He would step outside to take calls, then return saying it was work-related, and quickly change the subject before I could ask anything. He claimed he was restructuring client portfolios during late-night calls at 11 p.m. on Saturdays. I'm not a financial expert, but I'm fairly certain the stock market doesn't operate on weekends. Unless Grant had secret international clients, which he didn't. Something else was happening. His late nights at the office increased, 3 or 4 times a week. He wouldn't come home until midnight. He was a financial advisor, not an emergency surgeon. There was no reason for that schedule. Then I found receipts. A high-end restaurant downtown I had never visited, $280 for dinner for 2. A hotel located just 40 minutes from our home. Why would my husband need a hotel room so close by? When I asked, Grant always had an answer. Smooth, well-rehearsed explanations that came just a bit too quickly. Client dinners, networking events. The hotel was for a conference that ran late, and it made more sense to stay overnight rather than drive home tired. But when I asked more questions, when I pushed further, his tone changed. "Daphne, you're being paranoid. It's the hormones. My mother warned me about this. Women can become irrational during pregnancy. Don't turn into one of those wives." I ended up feeling ashamed just for asking. That's how effective he was. He made me apologize for doubting him. At the same time, financial pressure increased. Grant's requests about money became more frequent, more urgent, and more strategic. "We should add me to your trust. What if something happens during delivery? I need access to funds for the baby." It's practical. Power of attorney is just common sense. Every married couple does it, unless you don't trust me. "Your grandmother's house is too large for us. We should sell it and invest the money properly. I know exactly where to put it for maximum returns." He wanted me to sell my grandmother's home and hand over the proceeds for him to manage. This was the same man who needed 3 different streaming services because he couldn't remember which one had his shows. And I was supposed to trust him with millions? No. When I refused, calmly and carefully, his behavior changed immediately. The warmth disappeared. He became distant and cold. He started sleeping at the edge of the bed, claiming I moved too much now that I was pregnant. Arguments became more frequent. He would bring up the trust repeatedly, and when I refused, he would stop speaking to me for days. Interestingly, his silence always ended. Apparently, his principles had limits, and that limit was an empty stomach. He barely touched me anymore. He blamed my changing body, saying he didn't want to risk hurting the baby. On the surface, it sounded considerate, but in reality, it felt like rejection. I tried to talk to him about it. He dismissed me, saying I was being needy, hormonal, and difficult. Eventually, I began to question myself. One night, I woke up at 2 a.m., and Grant wasn't in bed. I found him in the kitchen, leaning over his phone, speaking quietly. I stood in the hallway and listened. "It's almost time," he said. "By spring, everything will be settled. Just need to wait until..." He noticed me and ended the call immediately. "Work emergency," he said. Go back to sleep. I didn't ask who has work emergencies at 2 a.m. involving something being settled by spring. I was too tired, too overwhelmed, and too determined to believe my marriage was still intact. The following week, my best friend Tara came over for lunch. She sat across from me and listened as I made excuse after excuse for Grant. His stress, his workload, his adjustment to becoming a father. Finally, she set down her fork and looked at me seriously. Daphne, listen to yourself. When was the last time you spoke to your mom? I didn't answer. When was the last time Grant was genuinely happy to see you? Not putting on a show for others, but actually happy when you walked in? I couldn't answer that either. Trust your instincts, Tara said. Something isn't right. I told her she was overreacting. But that night, I couldn't sleep. I kept thinking about everything. Grant's phone always face down, the late nights, his growing urgency about accessing my money. The way he sometimes looked at me when he thought I wasn't paying attention, like I was something to figure out, not someone to love. At 4 months pregnant, I went in for a routine OB appointment for an ultrasound. My regular doctor was on vacation, so I was scheduled with another physician, Dr. Claire Brennan. I went alone. Grant had a client meeting he claimed he couldn't miss. It started as a standard visit. I lay back on the exam table, cold gel on my stomach, waiting to see my baby moving on the screen like always. Dr. Brennan was polite and professional. She made small talk while preparing the equipment, asked how I was feeling, whether the baby had been active, nothing unusual. Then she opened my file. She glanced at the paperwork, and her expression changed. She looked at my husband's name, then at me, then back at the name again. I saw her hands begin to shake. She set down the ultrasound wand, reached over, and turned off the monitor completely. "Mrs. Mercer," she said quietly, "I need to speak with you privately right now." I immediately thought something was wrong with the baby. Every worst-case scenario ran through my mind in seconds. She led me to her office, closed the door, locked it, and then said the words that broke everything apart. "I know what your husband did, and I have proof." She pulled a folder from her desk drawer. Her hands were still trembling as she opened it. "My younger sister works at your fertility clinic," she explained. 3 weeks ago, she came to me in tears. She told me everything. "When I saw your husband's name on your file just now, I recognized it immediately." Dr. Brennan took a steady breath. "Mrs. Mercer, I'm very sorry, but you need to see this before you go home, before he realizes that you know." She placed the folder on the desk between us. In that moment, everything I believed about my marriage, my pregnancy, and the man I trusted began to fall apart. Her sister, Molly, worked as a nurse at the same fertility clinic Grant had carefully selected for our IVF treatment, the one he insisted was perfect for us. Now, his insistence made sense. Dr. Brennan explained the situation in detail. 3 weeks earlier, Molly had arrived at her apartment late at night, extremely distressed. She hadn't been sleeping, had lost weight, and was overwhelmed with guilt she could no longer carry. 7 months earlier, Molly said, a patient's husband had approached her at the clinic. He was polite, well-dressed, and convincing. He claimed he had a sensitive situation that required discretion. He told her his wife didn't know he planned to use donor sperm for their IVF cycle due to a supposed genetic issue he didn't want to burden her with. He presented it as a private decision, nothing harmful, just something he needed help keeping confidential. He offered her $30,000. For a nurse earning $52,000 a year and struggling with debt, it was a difficult offer to refuse. Molly agreed. Grant's sperm, unlikely to result in pregnancy, was replaced with donor sperm. The embryologist was also involved, having been approached separately with another payment. Together, they ensured the switch went unnoticed. The embryologist reassured Molly, telling her it wasn't their place to question what arrangements a married couple made. But the situation stayed with her, especially when she later saw that the procedure had been successful. Somewhere, a woman was carrying a child she believed was her husband's, and it wasn't. The guilt became overwhelming. Molly couldn't sleep, struggled at work, and began experiencing panic attacks. 3 weeks ago, she finally told her sister everything. I sat there listening as Dr. Brennan explained how my husband had spent $50,000 to create a situation that would make it appear as if I had been unfaithful. $50,000. more than he spent on our entire wedding, including the honeymoon. It clarified his priorities. But there was more. Dr. Brennan outlined the full plan, something Grant had been building step by step for over a year. Phase 1 was complete. Bribe clinic staff, switch the sperm samples, and ensure silence. Phase 2 was also complete. Wait for a successful pregnancy while presenting himself as a devoted, excited future father. Phase 3 was intended for after the birth. Grant planned to have the embryologist alter clinic records so it would appear that our IVF cycle had failed. This would create the impression that conception happened naturally afterward. Phase 4 involved setting the trap. After the baby was born, Grant would suggest a DNA test, presenting it as something meaningful, a keepsake to celebrate fatherhood. Phase 5 was the final step, when the DNA test showed he wasn't the biological father, and when the records indicated natural conception, he would have what he needed to support his claim. His wife had been unfaithful. The child wasn't his. He would position himself as the victim. Our prenuptial agreement included an infidelity clause, which is common in high-asset marriages. If one spouse cheats, they owe the other $500,000 in penalties. Additionally, the unfaithful spouse forfeits any claim to the other's assets. The wronged partner can also pursue further damages for emotional distress. Grant's end goal was clear. He intended to walk away with at least $500,000. He would damage my reputation, likely pursue additional claims through a lawsuit, and leave me overwhelmed, too confused and focused on protecting my child to defend myself effectively. He was relying on my shame to keep me compliant. And he almost succeeded. Dr. Brennan pulled additional documents from the folder. Molly had preserved everything. Original sample records showing the switch, the donor's identification number, and payment records linked to accounts controlled by Grant. There were also email exchanges between Grant and the embryologist. They had tried to be discreet, using personal accounts and vague wording, but the evidence was still clear. More than sufficient. Molly had even located the donor. His name was Derek Sykes, a 28-year-old graduate student who had been paid $15,000 in cash. Standard sperm donation typically pays around $100 to $200, so that amount should have raised concerns. However, financial pressure can influence decisions. Derek had been told it was a private arrangement for a couple seeking discretion. He had no idea he was involved in fraud. When he learned the truth, he was angry and agreed to cooperate. There was another detail Brennan shared carefully, something she had uncovered independently. Grant Mercer had accumulated $180,000 in gambling debt. He had been gambling for years. Online poker, sports betting, and casino visits he had described to me as business trips, all while presenting himself as a responsible financial advisor. The money used for the bribes, the $50,000 he spent to manipulate the IVF process and construct a case of adultery, had been taken from his own clients. Small amounts over time, concealed within financial records. His firm had not discovered it yet. Grant wasn't just targeting my inheritance. He was desperate. His debts were significant, and the people he owed were unlikely to be patient. These were not creditors who rely on formal processes. I was meant to be his solution. My grandmother's money was supposed to resolve his problems, and he was willing to destroy me to obtain it. I remained in that office for a long time, reviewing the documents laid out in front of me. The reality was difficult to process. First came shock, quiet and overwhelming, then disbelief. I reread the documents repeatedly, searching for an error or misunderstanding that might change the outcome. Gradually, everything began to align. The late nights, the private phone calls, his growing urgency about accessing my finances, and even his carefully measured behavior when we first met. He had researched me before we were introduced. The charity gala where we met was not a coincidence. He knew exactly who I was and what I had before he approached me. Even his tears at our wedding made sense. What I believed were tears of happiness were more likely relief. His long-term plan had reached a key milestone. And my mother, Vivian, whom I had distanced myself from for 2 years, calling her paranoid and overly protective, had recognized the truth within minutes. She said his smile didn't reach his eyes. She had tried to warn me. I chose not to listen. I considered confronting him immediately, returning home, placing the evidence in front of him and forcing an explanation. But instead, something else settled in, a sense of clarity, focus, control. He believed I would fall apart. His entire plan depended on it. He assumed that when faced with evidence of supposed infidelity, I would give in, hand over whatever he demanded just to resolve the situation. He believed I was weak, that I was unaware, that I would be easy to manipulate. He was mistaken. I looked at Dr. Brennan. He doesn't know that I know. No, she said. My sister hasn't told anyone else, and I only connected you to this when I saw your file today. Good. I gathered the documents carefully. I need copies of everything, and I need to speak with Molly directly. What are you planning to do? She asked. I stood, placing a hand on my stomach. The child I was carrying was completely innocent in all of this, a child who had no control over the circumstances, and one I already loved, regardless of DNA or anything else surrounding the situation. My husband thinks he's been planning strategically, I said. He believes he's ahead. He believes he's already secured the outcome. I adjusted my posture. He's about to realize that's not the case. I drove home from the appointment, maintaining a calm expression, steady hands on the wheel, and controlled breathing. 2 years earlier, Grant had installed security cameras around the house. At the time, he said it was for safety. Now I questioned whether it was also for monitoring, whether he reviewed footage, watching for any sign of suspicion. So I gave him nothing. He was waiting when I arrived, standing in the kitchen with that familiar smile, one that never fully reached his eyes. My mother's words came back to me, though much later than they should have. "How was the appointment?" he asked. "Is the baby okay?" I smiled, walked over, and hugged him. I showed him the ultrasound image Dr. Brennan had printed before everything changed. "Perfect," I said. "Everything is absolutely perfect." I maintained that composure throughout dinner, even as my thoughts shifted to the legal consequences he could face. I asked about his day while assessing the situation in my mind. I even laughed at a joke he made about baby names, despite it not being particularly amusing. I stayed consistent because it was necessary. I apologized for being paranoid recently, attributing it to hormones, the same explanation he had used against me for months. His reaction was immediate. The tension in his body eased. He believed everything was still under control. That night, he slept peacefully. I remained awake until 3 a.m., planning my next steps. The following morning, I called in sick to work. Then I drove 2 hours to another city, checking my mirrors frequently to ensure I wasn't being followed. It may have seemed excessive, but given the situation, it was justified. I located a private investigator named Rosalind Weaver, a former police detective with 15 years of experience before moving into private practice. She had a direct, no-nonsense attitude, sharp instincts, and the presence of someone who had seen everything and was rarely impressed. I explained the entire situation. She listened without interrupting, took notes, and when I finished, she gave a slight smile. "Your husband made several mistakes," she said. "They usually do when they're overconfident. Give me 2 weeks." She returned with results in 10 days. Grant's gambling debt totaled $180,000. He owed money to online betting platforms, underground poker groups, and private lenders who were unlikely to follow formal procedures. These were the type of creditors who respond aggressively when payments are delayed. The embezzlement was also confirmed. Approximately $53,000 missing from client accounts at his firm. The funds had been taken gradually over 18 months through small transactions designed to avoid detection. His firm was still unaware at that point. There was also the affair. It had been ongoing for 8 months with his assistant. Hotel stays, dinners, and weekend trips presented as business travel. Rosalind had gathered photos, text messages, and financial records. The evidence was complete. It was predictable. If someone is going to jeopardize a marriage, this pattern is unfortunately common. Rosalind uncovered something else as well. This was not Grant's first attempt to target a financially secure partner. 5 years earlier in Boston, he had been involved with a woman named Caroline Ashford, someone with family wealth and a trust fund. Their relationship lasted 8 months before she discovered suspicious activity in a joint account he had encouraged her to open. She ended the relationship immediately, but chose not to pursue legal action at the time. Rosalind located her. Caroline agreed to provide a statement. She had long regretted not holding him accountable earlier. I later met Molly Brennan in private, a quiet coffee shop about an hour away where neither of us would be recognized. She looked exhausted, visibly affected by everything that had happened. The stress had clearly taken a toll. She began apologizing immediately. She admitted she knew it was wrong, but had been influenced by financial pressure and by Grant's explanation. She believed at the time that he was trying to handle a sensitive medical issue discreetly. I stopped her and asked a single question. "Are you willing to testify officially on record?" She agreed without hesitation. "I'll tell the truth. I should have reported it immediately, but I was afraid of losing my license, my job, everything. But yes, I'll testify under oath." I studied her for a moment. She had participated in something serious, but she had also been manipulated. Grant had identified her vulnerability and used it. "Don't be afraid anymore," I told her. "You're not responsible for what he planned. He is." The embryologist, once he realized Molly had kept records and was cooperating, also agreed to provide a statement. His motivation was clear. He wanted to protect his license and avoid severe consequences. The most difficult step was calling my mother. 2 years of minimal contact. 2 years of choosing Grant over her. I had dismissed her concerns, excluded her from family events, and questioned her judgment when she had been correct from the beginning. The phone rang twice before she answered. "Daphne?" Her voice was careful, but there was hope in it. "Mom," I said, and my voice faltered. "You were right about him. About everything. I'm sorry." There was a pause. I expected criticism, or at least acknowledgement of the past. Instead, she asked, "What do you need?" She didn't remind me of the warnings I ignored. She didn't express frustration or disappointment. She focused on helping. That response had a deeper impact than anything else. My mother is a retired attorney who specialized in estate law for 30 years. Within 48 hours, she connected me with a highly experienced divorce attorney in Connecticut and a prosecutor who handled fraud cases. She reminded me of something important. People who genuinely care about you are not focused on being proven right. They are focused on supporting you when it matters. I had spent 2 years distancing myself from her, yet her first response was still to protect me. My attorney, Sandra Kowalski, appeared unassuming, short with silver hair and reading glasses, but she was highly effective. She reviewed all the evidence: clinic records, Molly's statement, the investigator's findings, proof of the affair, and the embezzlement details. When she finished, she looked at me and said, "Your husband is facing charges for fraud, conspiracy, and embezzlement." She explained that the prenuptial agreement's infidelity clause now worked in my favor, since he had been unfaithful. Additionally, his plan to alter medical records constituted intent to commit a serious criminal offense. She coordinated with the prosecutor. Molly provided a formal sworn statement. The embryologist cooperated in exchange for reduced charges. Grant's firm was informed about the missing funds and began an internal investigation, immediately restricting his access to accounts. A judge reviewed the evidence, determined there was sufficient cause, and issued an arrest warrant for fraud, conspiracy, and embezzlement. 6 weeks after the ultrasound appointment, I suggested hosting a gathering, a baby celebration at my grandmother's estate. Both families, close friends, and colleagues were invited. Grant was enthusiastic. To him, it was another opportunity to reinforce his image. He offered to help organize it, but I declined, telling him to focus on work and simply attend. He had no idea that the arrangements included law enforcement nearby, legal counsel present, key witnesses available, and all evidence prepared. The event was scheduled for Saturday. That morning, Grant prepared carefully, rehearsing his public demeanor. He believed he was attending a celebration that would support his plan. The estate was set for the occasion, gardens in bloom, guests gathered, and everything arranged for what appeared to be a formal family event. Grant moved comfortably among the guests, presenting himself as attentive and engaged. His behavior was consistent with the image he had maintained throughout. My mother observed quietly from a distance. At one point, she raised her glass slightly toward me, a subtle signal. Around mid-afternoon, Grant introduced the idea he had been hinting at for weeks, a DNA test to celebrate fatherhood. He framed it as meaningful and symbolic, suggesting the results could be revealed during the gathering. Guests responded positively. I agreed, appearing hesitant at first, then supportive once others encouraged the idea. Grant believed everything was proceeding exactly as planned. Instead of producing a test kit, I walked to the platform prepared for speeches and picked up the microphone. "Thank you all for being here," I began. "This gathering is about family and honesty." I looked toward Grant. "My husband wanted to share something today, so I will help present it." His expression shifted slightly. I took out a folder. Several months ago, I learned information that changed my understanding of my marriage. Today, I'm sharing it because this situation should be addressed with transparency. I explained the fertility diagnosis, the IVF process, and presented the original clinic records before any alterations. These documents show that my husband arranged for his sample to be replaced with donor material without my knowledge. Payments were made to clinic staff and to the donor. I indicated toward Derek Sykes, who stepped forward and confirmed his involvement, explaining he had not been aware of the full situation at the time. I continued outlining the plan, how Grant intended to use a DNA test and altered records to falsely claim infidelity and enforce financial penalties under the prenuptial agreement. Grant attempted to interrupt, suggesting I was mistaken. I continued. I presented evidence of embezzlement, referencing the funds taken from his clients. His employer, who was present, was already aware and investigating. I then addressed his financial situation, his gambling debt, and introduced evidence of his ongoing affair. I also mentioned the prior incident in Boston.